What happens with elections is that elections favour the self-assertive. Elections favour the confident, the well-heeled, the well-educated. And part of our problem, the biggest problem, while everyone talks about diversity, the biggest diversity problem we face is diversity of education. People with less education feel enraged. As someone with too much education, welcome to our renamed podcast, Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. You're here for the first episode, and we're going to talk about an essay that I've been writing called Democracy Forking the Project. A couple of takeouts from the conversation, I'm hoping, will be that one of the solutions to our problems with democracy is that we need to trust ourselves more. And the other is that the democracies we've built in the modern world are hogtied by their history, and their history is in monarchy. That's true not just in Britain and Australia, but also in other modern countries like the United States. You'll learn more about that as we go on. My name's Nicholas Gruen, and I'll introduce my friend Peyton Bowman, and then we'll get on with it.
Hi, Nicholas. Yes, thank you. I've read the essay that you wrote, not yet published, but looking forward to seeing that out in the world at some point soon, hopefully. Well, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what led you to write this essay.
So I'm at the stage where my own view, as you know, as many people who know me will know, I think that it is very important that we start to introduce more citizen juries in our democracy, what I call the other way to represent the people, and I might say a bit more about that in a minute, and that there's now quite a substantial community around the world who agrees with this, but the way we have been going about trying to bring it about is that lots of people go and talk to politicians and say you really should do that and this, and lots of politicians are quite well disposed to it, but progress doesn't seem to be terribly fast. And the other thing we've been doing is we've been having little demonstration projects which are usually government-sponsored, specific issue citizen juries. Now, a citizen jury, just to be clear, is a group of people brought together like a jury in a court case, randomly selected or selected in a representative way from everyday people in the community. And we're not really making much progress. And I'm think that the way to make progress is to wrestle free of politics as usual, to see if we can get some philanthropic funding and some crowdfunding, and to actually simply do this ourselves. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to establish a standing citizens jury, a citizen jury which would be really quite like a House of Parliament, and anything that went through the Parliament or the Congress would make its way into and through this chamber, this citizen chamber, this chamber of everyday folks trying to figure stuff out and arrive at their considered view about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And so I wanted to write an essay explaining.
And just to be clear, this Standing Citizens Council, this is what you describe as being privately or philanthropically or crowdfunded, but it wouldn't have any formal government authority at the initial point.
Correct. So it'd be nice to go to government. One would try to stay in touch with government, and one would say, we think if this shapes up, if we can show you the quality of the discussion, if we can show the people the quality of the discussion that takes place in this chamber, and the quality of the deliberations, in other words, the quality of the conclusions, we would like to lobby you to say that you should start giving this chamber some power, but we know that's, you're not going to do that in a hurry. And in the meantime, we are not waiting for permission. We are going to go ahead and run this thing, and it will be very like the sort of thing that we would like to see built into business as usual. But we know that that is the next stage. So that's basically what I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the essay, you talk a little bit about some examples of
Yeah,
how having the influence of a chamber like this or a council like this might have
yeah,
improved some situations in the past.
exactly. So I've I've just written this. I'll read you these dot points and interpolate what I want to as I go through them. So I've written, in contrast to their votes in elections and opinion polls, in juries, citizens, one, seek to understand each other's perspectives. Two, are less impatient and punitive. Now, we're starting to see, so two comments I've made there, really, or implications are, if they're seeking to understand each other's perspectives, then I'm thinking that heads the citizen chamber towards the centre of politics, and I'm suggesting that's probably a good thing. Certainly politics has become far more polarised. In fact, in many ways, outside the United States, it's become far more polarised rhetorically, while the actual policies of the two sides remain surprisingly similar. And that's even true in the United States, although less true. Two, are less impatient and punitive. Well, an example where that's relevant would be the war on drugs, mass incarceration, again, a particular American problem, but turning into a problem in other places. The electoral politics of punitive action is very strong. As people learn more about the issues and actually eyeball the people that they're saying should be sent to prison and are confronted by the fact that this person is actually quite like them or quite like someone they know. And this doesn't mean they think, oh, that's good, it's okay that you committed armed robbery or you did something terrible, but they actually come to see the other person as another person who needs maybe quite firm dealing with, but not purely punitive dealing with. So that's point two. Point three, they're more prepared to defend basic democratic norms. So it's a fact. I think this is also true in Australia. So when I was a kid, there was a reasonable gerrymander throughout Australia. I'll call technically it's a malapportionment. I won't bother you with the difference. People can look it up if they want to, or we'll put it in the show notes, or they can email me. But think of it as a gerrymander. And it was a gerrymander in favour of the conservative side of politics. That's also true in the United States today, where there's quite a strong, there's gerrymanders. They're not all pro-conservative. They're not all pro-Republican, but more of them are pro-Republican than pro-Democrat. But if you poll Americans, do you think gerrymandering is a good idea? 92% of Democrats say it's not a good idea. But of course, they're the ones who are losing from most gerrymanders. But what do you think Republicans think of gerrymandering? Ordinary, everyday Republican voters, 88% of them think gerrymandering is a bad idea. So while we panic that people are becoming less supportive of democracy, that doesn't sound like they're less supportive of democracy to me. Right. It sounds like they're being confronted with invidious choices. If you want to vote Republican, if you hate woke culture or Hillary Clinton or whoever you want to, whatever is motivating you, you're faced with the idea that you can vote Republican, and then you're voting for, quite likely you're voting for a Republican gerrymander. Do you want to vote for a Republican gerrymander? Well, only 12% of Republicans want to vote for a Republican gerrymander, and most Republicans don't. So that's how the system works. It works to defend the power of the powerful, because the powerful get into a position to impose an invidious choice on voters. So if we have more faith in ourselves, if we can make this system more mature, if we can have more representation by sampling, which is what happens in a jury, as opposed to representation by competition in an election, which is what happens in our political system, if we can have a better balance of those things, then we will be able to defend the basic democratic norms on which any decent democracy has to be built.
I mean, it's interesting when you say faith in ourselves. It's also faith in ourselves as a community, right? So I kind of imagine, for example, even those 12% of Republicans who say, yeah, we should do as much gerrymandering as we can. Maybe that's not their opinion. Some of that justification, at least, has to be, well, we have to do it because if we don't do it, the other side's going to do it.
That's right. That's right. And there's so much weaponization and also just bad dealing, because the Democrats don't exactly have a spotless record in that regard. And in some respects, yes, the Republican Party, if you go back a century, has a rather more glorious past than the Democrat Party as far as issues like that is concerned. So that's exactly right. So the way I've put it is that powerful people impose invidious choices on voters. And another way to put it is precisely the way you've put it, which is that in all of these things, you get a race to the bottom because you have this thought, well, if I don't do it, they'll do it. And that is massively undermining of what as I said to you earlier, with that amount of raw support of non-gerrymandered electorates, we're throwing all that away with a system which encourages distrust. And we don't need that system for those kinds of things, because because Democrats and Republicans are in a perfectly good position to trust each other if they together defend themselves and the electoral system against gerrymandering. So if we can, so that's the idea, which we'll maybe get onto, that we try to build a system which is capable of defending those norms, because at the moment, certainly in the United States, there are some really big problems in that regard.
I mean, I think beyond the United States, you gave some examples of some, let's say, political failures that have happened in recent history. You mentioned, for example, carbon pricing in Australia, some of the negotiations around Brexit, the kind of role of nuclear energy might play in a green response to climate change, the situation with Donald Trump and the January 6th insurrection, and also more recently, which wasn't in your article, we discussed some of the problems that South Africa is having with corruption in its central government and dealing with this huge energy crisis they're having.
Yeah. So look at the question of Brexit. You've given a nice summary of those issues, and maybe we'll leave most of them on the table, and we can follow them up if anyone wants to follow them up with us. But I'll just go into Brexit because it's a nice example. As many people listening to this will remember, 52% of Britons voted for Brexit in June 2016, if I've got the month right. I think I have. And 48 voted against it. In 2017, there was a citizen jury held in London, and but it had a catchment of wider than London, so some of the people they brought in from outside, and they set it up so that 52. So they set it up with 50 people, and 26 of them were in favour of Brexit, and it's no coincidence that that's 52% of them, and 24 or 48% of them were against Brexit. And they spent 4 days going over the issues, and the citizen jury was notionally about what kind of Brexit people wanted. And in fact, quite an interesting story lies behind that, because I got interested in this and I started communicating with the people who had run it. And I said, can I have a look at your data? And what I'm interested in is whether people changed their minds about Brexit. And they said, oh, well, we didn't do it for that. We just did it. We were just running this citizen jury to see what citizens thought was the sort of Brexit they wanted. Well, that was spin. That was run by 4 universities, and they were terrified that the Daily Mail and the Sun would come after them and say that they were elitists and they were trying to stop Brexit and all the rest of it. If you look, now, in fact, they sort of had run the citizen jury as they said they had run it, but at the same time, there was a question coming out of the jury. There was a question they asked, which is whether people still supported Brexit or whether they still supported Leave. And that produced a swing away from Brexit from 52% in favour to 60% against.
Oh, wow.
Not only that, but nobody changed from supporting Remain to supporting Brexit. So the chances of that being just chance, the chances that was just produced by randomness is the same chances that you would have of flipping a coin 7 times and it coming up with the same, and it coming up heads every time.
Wow.
So we have a 99% statistical significance that this process, or as I like to put it, in making the journey from the opinion of the people to the considered opinion of the people, produces a substantial swing. And the other nice thing about this is the British people have learnt quite a lot about the Brexit that they got, and about 60% of them now think it was a mistake.
Oh, wow.
So we get a beautiful alignment between, if you like, 2 ways of getting to the considered opinion of the people.
Yeah.
Run a giant, massively costly experiment, which then can't be reset without further cost and agony of various kinds, or try to make sure that what we do as a community represents the considered opinion of the people.
Yeah. And these people were just selected completely at random. I mean, from
They
that.
they were selected by there are various jargon terms for it, but think of it as random. So think of it as continually random selection. But if you end up with more women than you want or men than you want, then you throw a few away and you keep going until you get the right balance, so that you get the right a representative number of people in certain age groups, a representative number of people outside of major cities and inside major cities, a representative number of gender of people of different genders. So now, just to be clear, it's not trying to bias it towards or against advantage or disadvantage or any of that stuff. It's just trying to say that it's trying to minimise the chance that any results you get out of this process is a kind of a product of the randomness rather than the result of the way
Right.
people deliberated and got to their considered opinion.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think that's amazing, and especially the outcome with 60% inside this committee and then 60% in the
Yeah,
general population after this after this experiment. It's so interesting.
yeah,
So so getting back to the Standing Citizens Council,
yeah,
if I might. So
yeah,
I assume that this can exercise influence, for example, just by serving as an example to people about what kinds of discourse are very effective and really unifying and getting people to having a like really good decision making process for
yeah.
but
Well, no, I don't think I'm more because partly for reasons that explain the title of this podcast, Peyton, Uncomfortable Collisions with
yeah.
Reality. I'm try. If you think about your country, the United States, but also it's also true for Britain, also true for Australia. Some tremendous. We find it hard to make really bad decisions without them being pretty controversial and often quite difficult to get through. So, our Prime Minister Tony Abbott didn't have. It wasn't easy for Tony Abbott. It wasn't a lay down misere for Tony Abbott to get the abolition of carbon pricing in Australia through the Australian Parliament. It was actually quite difficult. And so I think it would have a substantial effect here and now, and not by having a nice little model of an alternative, but actually putting pressure on democratically elected politicians at times of great moment. So I'm pretty confident that something like 60% of ordinary Australians would have seen the abolition of carbon pricing for what it was. It was a nice slogan to take to an election, and it set Australia into it. It hadn't solved the problem. What Tony Abbott said was, we'll achieve these targets, but we won't do it with a carbon price. Well, how would he do it? Well, we didn't hear about that until after the election, and then we didn't hear much about it after the election either. And we are gradually making our way back towards mechanisms that are starting to look a bit like carbon pricing, because it's just obvious that, and the way that happens is you start imposing restrictions on companies to emit, and then you allow them to go and buy offsets, and fairly soon there's a price. There's something like a price on carbon. Now, it doesn't take long. It doesn't, and you don't have to be a genius to work this out. And so, had we had this thing, and let's say it was privately funded, had no official role in the Australian Constitution, I think it would have had a powerful effect at the time. You might recall, in the case of Great Britain, that even with a large conservative majority, they have a stronger tradition of voting, of crossing the floor. I don't know whether you have that expression in the United States. Probably less so, because you're less divided into a government and an opposition. But quite a lot of conservative politicians were prepared to cross the floor. They ended up essentially being bullied into supporting the Brexit that we got, but the government did not have a totally free hand. Boris Johnson didn't, and Theresa May did not have a totally free hand to do whatever they wanted. So again, had there been a standing citizen assembly, a standing citizen chamber, I think that would have had a big impact. And then if you go to the United States, think about all your debt ceiling negotiations. Eventually they end up in a crisis, and somebody so far has given in, and the Republic has been saved from financial default and the catastrophic impact that could have. Think of the think of the second impeachment of President Donald Trump. I think there were quite a few Republicans in the Senate who voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump. So you weren't that far. You may know the numbers better than me, but I think you needed another 10, or maybe less than that. I think you only needed 10 Republican senators, because you've got 100 senators in there. I think you only needed 10 Republican senators to get to 60%. Is that the number, or is it 2/3? I'm not sure.
I think it's 2/3, but
Yeah.
don't quote me on it. I didn't
Anyway,
prepare this number
my point
beforehand. Yeah.
is that most Americans, if they sat through the evidence and spoke to other Americans, they would say, I assert, I know that Donald Trump still enjoys about, over 40% of the vote, but I think if they sat through that, they would say, no, we don't want a president who rings up a foreign leader and says, I'm not going to give you money for arms unless you do a favour for me, a domestic political favour for me. I mean, that's extraordinary. And I think people would, I'm pretty sure, reassured by their fellow Americans, a substantial number of Americans, including Republican Americans, would say, yeah, I don't want to support that sort of thing. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that's a way. Those are some examples of how I think the citizen jury, a citizen assembly, can in fact organise for our elected politicians some uncomfortable collisions with reality.
Well, one of the formal powers you suggest giving to a body like this, maybe not in this kind of initial phase, but once people, let's say, accept that this kind of body has value and can support the democracy in a way, is calling for a secret ballot, right? Which I think was really interesting in this particular case, because, I mean, we know that even what we've learned last week was that even Tucker Carlson hates Donald Trump, right? But he can't say that to people, you know?
That's right.
So, I mean, I do
when
think
when the cameras are off, Tucker isn't a big fan.
so. I mean, the number of Republicans who I think dislike Donald Trump, but who are afraid of his
Exactly.
influence on their voter base,
Exactly.
so they would never vote against him in a public ballot.
Yeah.
But if a citizens jury was like, well, we think that you guys are going to vote a little bit better, you not you guys, but you representatives will vote a little bit better if you're not being watched by everybody. Let's try that and see what it comes
That's
out
right.
with, right? So
Yeah. So I like this idea of mine. It's a sneaky little idea because it seems to be very modest. It is very modest. It continues to be minimalist about how much power this organization has. It has one power and one power only in this model. Now, I don't have a problem with giving it more power over time, but this is the first power I would like the body to and the body, hopefully, if it agrees, to lobby for this power, which is if and only if it disagrees with the resolution of a House, with the conclusion that a House of Congress or Parliament came to. If the Parliament voted, if a chamber like the House of Commons or the House of Representatives in the United States voted a majority to pass a bill, and the citizens jury, the citizens assembly disagrees with that vote, they go back to the House of Representatives and they say, vote again and vote secretly like we all can when we cast our vote in the community. Now, the secret ballot, Australians like to think of it used to be called the Australian ballot because it was an innovation that was used widely in Australia in the 19th century. A secret ballot was used for the populace because the populace was being intimidated. A landlord would turn up round up his tenants and go to the polling booth and would be able to see who his tenants voted for. So we cut through that and we said that is a matter between a person and their conscience. Now, you can't do that with a parliamentarian or a congressperson because they are accountable to the people. We don't want secret agents getting there. So this is an exceptional situation. Generally speaking, their final votes should be public. But if those votes disagree with the considered opinion of the people they represent, they can be asked to vote again, they can be asked to vote secretly, and then we will see. Now, what kind of difference could that make? I have no doubt that with Brexit, I have no doubt with the abolition of carbon pricing in Australia, that would have made a big difference. I have little doubt that it would have made enough difference in the Senate to impeach Donald Trump, because you only need 10 Republicans, or maybe it's 10 more Republicans. You've already got all the Democrats. I don't think any of the Democrats would have changed sides with a secret ballot. So you're creating a circumstance for really quite substantial change there, and yet you've done it with the most modest of powers. Now, there's another person who I think we've both interviewed James about this some time ago.
That's right. D'Angelo, right?
D'Angelo, correct. And he makes a somewhat different point, but it's a very important point, which is that the final votes, as I understand it, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, as I understand it, the final votes on a bill in the plenary session of Congress will always be public. Normal procedure in the US Congress for committees to be had in secret, which sounds like a very scary thing, parliamentarians meeting in secret. Well, of course, that happens all the time. They do it in their own rooms. And these committee meetings would then thrash through compromises between Democrats and Republicans. And his argument, and he's got a lot to show for it. I don't think it's the complete answer as to why we've become so polarised, but I think it's a powerful answer as to why Congress people have become more polarised, which is that all those confidential meetings, if you want to call them by a nice name, secret meetings, if you want to make them sound conspiratorial, they were all prized open. And they were prized open by progressive liberals in the American sense of the term, progressive left liberals from the civil rights period on the basis that transparency would improve governance. But transparency to one group is transparency to another group. And after the transparency was opened up, then you had organisations like the NRA and various other organisations. And I don't want to be mistaken for saying the NRA's objectives are bad, but I will say that the NRA's completely uncompromising stance, which is that we can't even have background checks for guns, that's essentially a kind of political threat. It's a red line that they put there. It's not good policy. It's obviously not good policy. When people can buy guns, but they're not allowed to drink alcohol and various other and they're not allowed to drive cars in certain, in various ways if they don't pass certain background checks. They're not allowed to teach in schools without certain background checks, but they are allowed to go out and get automatic rifles. Well, or semi-automatic rifles. That's obviously an abuse of a certain approach, and that's what was brought in, and that's what could be taken out if we allowed this. You wouldn't need to make committee meetings. This is an alternative. You don't necessarily have to make committee meetings more have them in secret again, although maybe that's a good idea, I don't know. But you can say that if you deviate from the considered opinion of ordinary folks, you will have a secret ballot imposed upon you, and then we would have background checks in the United States for the purchase of guns.
Well, I think if whether you're talking about the NRA or any other lobby group, I think if you asked an ordinary American if money should play a big role in the decision-making process of our representatives, they would say, no, we would prefer
Yeah.
them to do what we
Yeah,
voted them
exactly.
to do and to vote
Exactly.
on their conscience. And I
Exactly.
think that that's
Yeah.
the main objective of having people, having these kinds of votes reviewed by a citizens jury,
Yeah.
and then giving the citizens jury, in a sense, providing an excuse or a reason for
Yeah.
these people to vote with their conscience and not with
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
with their the influence of the people who are paying them money. The thing I really like about this system is it really is built around the idea of conscience, right? It's not really built around money per se. It's not built around some idea of social class or social hierarchy. Do you think there are other ways in which this kind of organization, let's say, runs on conscience besides forcing it through the secret ballot or something along these lines?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, firstly, I guess the way I'd put it is that I guess the way I would like to characterize this proposal is that it's business as usual, in the sense that the basics of the system we have now remains in place. We can argue about how much it needs to change. And I don't have a strong view about that, because I'd like to see this alternative in action. But what the alternative, but what I've sketched out is something which puts a boundary around some of the worst behaviour of business as usual. And that boundary is characterised by where the tension is greatest between party discipline and money and power on the one hand, and the consciences of our elected representatives on the other. And it creates a bounded domain in which their conscience can matter. And I think because that tension has become so big in recent times, that can be a very big deal in and of itself. And then I think it gives us the foundation to go further. And let me just sketch out something a little more about that. I won't give you much detail, but what I will say is that if you set this system up, remember that the citizens in a citizen assembly, if the ancient Athenians are anything to go by, if all of our traditions are anything to go by, they get refreshed often. So maybe every year you get a new bunch of people. That's certainly what happens where they do this sort of thing in Belgium. So you're getting new, completely people, just completely people who've just come off the boat, as it were, people who've just stepped out of ordinary life and they've become politicians in some sense. So they're forever amateurs. So the next part of the problem is to say that the House of Representatives, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the Senate, they have had their own traditions for hundreds of years. Some of the best people there have spent whole lifetimes there building up ideas, building up traditions, building up habits of mind and of practice. So if this other way to represent the people is to be given a chance to evolve in a similarly rich kind of way, we have to find a way to identify some of the best of the, let's say there are 150 people chosen or 100 people chosen for the citizen chamber. We want to find a way to identify some of the best people there, but I'm wary of making it elections, because we've seen that elections, what happens with elections is that elections favour the self-assertive. Elections favour the confident, the well-heeled, the well-educated. And part of our problem, the biggest problem, while everyone talks about diversity, the biggest diversity problem we face is diversity of education. People with less education feel enraged. As someone with too much education, I feel enraged on their behalf. I'm not more of a human being than they are. Their views about what we should do, however much I disagree with them, we'll draw the line at genocide, perhaps. But I'll disagree with them passionately, or some of them, about, say, the death sentence. But they're human beings. This is supposed to be a democracy, and if after discussion that's what they think, that's what we should do as a democracy. That's a little cavalier of me, because there's also the question of individual rights, and I won't kind of get into all that. So that's the next thing to think about, which is how might we take this body, refresh it so that these are just ordinary folks. These are just Mr. Smith Goes to Washington types of folks, if you get the reference. A famous old movie from the late 40s, I think, Hollywood movie. How do we do that? And the other thing that I'll say at the end of our discussion is that I promised at the beginning of this discussion to talk about the significance of monarchy as the foundation for all modern democracies, and we haven't got onto that, but that'll be a fun thing to talk about in a future discussion.
Yeah, the way in which these democracies are still, in a sense, haunted by the legacy of the kings
Indeed.
that these states
That's
came
right.
from. So
Yeah,
I think
nicely put.
that in of itself is a fascinating topic, and would love to discuss it at a future time. We are now, we're about 40 minutes in, so maybe we will wrap up for today.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Nicholas. It was really great
Great.
to talk.
Thanks, Peyton.